Hi guys, I'm Mike and this is F1 Fanatics. Welcome back to another F1 Worldwide The Fan podcast, guys, and we are welcoming on another guest and another Australian. Obviously our resident Australian Mark with the feeder series is on, but we actually have a different one today, and that is Jack from Triple Crown Racing. So Jack, welcome to the show.
Oh, thank you so much. It's great to be here. Thank you for having me on the show.
No problem at all, and actually this is round 2 for me and Jack, because when you're recording YouTube videos, you have this perfect plan in place, you think everything's going to go right, and then for some reason something goes wrong, but it just means that it's going to be an even better chat for you guys, hopefully at home. And so, you know, we don't just kind of introduce guys on the channel, we talk about a topic about F1, and obviously Jack's YouTube channel is called Triple Crown Racing, so why not talk about the guy who is the only man in history to date to have the Triple Crown, and to talk about the Triple Crown in a little bit more detail, because it is one of those esteemed awards within the world of motorsport, especially back through the 1960s when Graham Hill achieved it, well, technically going into the 1970s. But it's certainly something interesting to go and look into. So, Jack, we're going to start off talking about Graham Hill. Where do we start with Graham? I suppose we start at the start of his career, all the way back in the 1950s.
Yeah, well, I should explain. That's sort of my blunder that we're doing this again, but hopefully this will be probably better the second time round. So Graham Hill started off his racing career in an interesting way. He didn't really follow the conventional path into Formula One that most drivers would do. Then again, back in the 50s, I should say, you know, it wasn't always a conventional path to Formula One. Some guys would do the Formula 3, Formula 2 type thing, and some people would just kind of find their way in. Graham was one of those people that sort of found their way in. And, well, he started off his career with Team Lotus in 1958. It was a pretty poor season for him. He wasn't classified in the championship. He did, I'm just going to count this here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 races. And he only finished 2 of them, and he finished 6th and 16th at the Italian Grand Prix and the Moroccan Grand Prix. Then, well, in 1959, he was still with Team Lotus. Again, Lotus were quite I think they were a reasonably new team back in the 50s, so, you know, it wasn't always smooth sailing right from the start. But it was really when he got into the 60s that his career really got going. So in 1960, he scored his first podium in the Netherlands with BRM, which was also known as the... Oh, sorry, not the Netherlands. Yeah, the Dutch Grand Prix. It was also known as the Owen Racing Organization back then, but it was BRM. He scored his first podium in that season. Then in 1961, he was still with BRM. It wasn't as good for him then, with a fifth place being his best result in the USA. But then his luck seemed to have changed. Seemed to just changed in 1962, still with BRM, and that was actually the year of his first championship.
Yeah, I completely agree that Graham had a strange path into F1, because, well, he didn't even have a driving licence until he was 24. He did do Formula 3, but, you know, that was casual. He was a mechanic at Lotus, and we'll find that Graham has a great way with words, and obviously he seemed to kind of be fond with the Team Lotus team and managed to talk his way back into the seat for his first Grand Prix start at Monaco, which is quite funny that one didn't pan out right, because he turned out to be very successful at the classic street circuit. But yeah, BRM is really where Graham's career started, wasn't it? It's when he made that move, it was, yeah, exactly, it just kind of got a upturn of momentum, and yeah, eclipsing with that '62 World Championship, he'd achieved, you know, an illustrious title that very few men before him had achieved, considering that Fangio took 5 of them in the past decade. So yeah, it was a pretty special achievement to get that first world title under his belt.
Yeah, so he won the opening race of the season at the Dutch Grand Prix. He followed that up with a 6th place at Monaco, which isn't the greatest result, but obviously he would have better results at Monaco in the future. He got 2nd at the Belgian Grand Prix. Then it was a bit of a lackluster race in France. 4th in Great Britain. 2 race wins back to back in Germany and Italy. 2nd place in the USA, and finished 1st at the South American Grand Prix, and that was enough for him to win the championship. Which is a really impressive result for, what was it, his 5th season in Formula One.
Yeah, it was certainly kind of a rapid progress of improvement, and I think it was really the start of his prime within Formula One. I obviously will say, because all the way up until 1972, when he won his Le Mans race, obviously his talent was still there even into the 70s, but I would say the combination of having the car and having the ability was the prime time during that kind of 62 to probably 1969. That kind of, start to the late 60s was where he performed his best within the sport. And I think he was probably quite unique in the aspect. Obviously we said that he joined Lotus through kind of talking his way up from a mechanic position, and he gained this reputation of, you know, being very particular with the setup of the car, keeping his, you know, lap record times and working long hours with the mechanics to make sure that the car was right. And, you know, quite a lot of the drivers had a deeper understanding of the car at the time, because a lot of them had to. Because I remember the stories of Fangio in the 50s. It was basically him and his co-driver. So if something went wrong on the car, he was going to have to figure it out himself when he was like doing a long 2,000 whatever kilometre endurance race, which, you know, were just mental back in the day. So it was certainly a really good asset, I think, for Graham Hill to have to his racing.
Yeah, it certainly was. But then in 1963, we sort of scratched the surface of what he became known for, because he would win the first of quite a few Monaco Grand Prix and achieve the first leg of the Triple Crown, which I'm sure we're going to get into as we go on. He wouldn't win the championship that year, but he picked up a couple of race wins, and it was overall a pretty good season for him. In 1964, he would win Monaco again, proving that the first time round wasn't a fluke. He would also finish 2nd in the championship again. And then in 1965, he would win Monaco again and finish 2nd in the championship again. So he was definitely proving himself on the streets of Monaco, and that is no fluke. Winning Monaco 3 times, you can't fluke a win at Monaco, and you certainly cannot fluke you certainly can't fluke 3 wins at Monaco in 3 years in succession. Obviously, it would have been a little bit frustrating to finish 2nd in the championship 3 times, but again, you know, that shows that, you know, he was getting the consistent results in, and he was consistently proving himself as somebody who had the potential to challenge for championships.
Yeah, certainly, and I think just by being that level of performance that he was always, you know, in the top 2 for that period, and like you said, winning Monaco is no fluke, and especially at times like there, it was an incredibly challenging street circuit for the drivers, and still to this day, Monaco is the track that all drivers want to win. You know, some people may complain whether they think it's an exciting race anymore, but the prestige to drivers for winning this one race is absolutely huge, and it means a lot. And for Graham Hill to do it those 3 years successively, and obviously we'll talk about he won it another 2 times later in his career as well. you know, like I said, no fluke, but one you could maybe argue was a fluke, although you've still got to be there to take advantage of. We'll move to 1966 and across the pond in terms of his second part of the Triple Crown and winning the Indianapolis 500. It was quite an interesting appearance for Graham, wasn't it?
Well, it was. Well, I think before we get into the Indianapolis 500 in 1966, we should actually talk a little bit about the Triple Crown, because we haven't really gotten too much into it. Obviously, as many race fans know, the Triple Crown is an unofficial achievement in motorsport that consists... Well, actually, there's two different versions of the Triple Crown, but the main one consists of the Monaco Grand Prix, the 24 Hours of Le Mans, and the Indianapolis 500. So obviously there is another variation of the Triple Crown as well, which consists of the Formula One World Championship, the Monaco Grand Prix, and the Formula One World Championship, the Indianapolis 500, and the 24 Hours of Le Mans. Graham Hill is actually the only man who has achieved the Triple Crown in any respect. So he was obviously a Formula One World champion. He won the Monaco Grand Prix in 1963, 1964, 1965, 1968, and 1969 with BRM and Lotus. And of course, we'll get more into his Le Mans. I'm sure we'll get more into his Le Mans exploits later, but we can talk about the 1966 Indianapolis 500. So I actually watched the short highlights, if you will, of the 66 Indianapolis 500 before we recorded the first time round. And, well, how he actually came to race at the Indianapolis 500 is quite interesting. So Hill drove for Mecom Racing, the Mecom Racing team, and they were running a couple of other drivers at that race as well. I'm pretty sure they were running Jackie Stewart at that race as well. But the original driver who was supposed to be in Graham's seat was a guy called Walt Hangzen, and he actually died at a Le Mans test session. Now, the thing about motorsport in the 60s was that the role of a racing driver was sort of interchangeable. They were just a racing driver. They would basically drive any race car anywhere in the world for anyone. That's just, if you were a racing driver, you were a racing driver. It's not really like how it is now, where if you're a Formula One driver, you're just kind of a Formula One driver. Racing drivers did everything back then. The second thing you need to know about the 60s is that a lot of people died. And Walt Hangzen was obviously one of those people, and, well, Graham Hill just managed to exploit that opportunity and got himself into the Mecom Racing seat for the Indianapolis 500. If I remember correctly, Hill started 15th on the grid for Indy, and right from the start of the race, there was an enormous crash that took out a huge portion of the field. I'm pretty sure the race was red flagged for a little while, and then they eventually got back to racing. And he was making his way through the field, obviously, but the people who were really controlling the race was Lloyd Ruby. I believe his name was Lloyd Ruby. I'm just going to check that. Hold on. So 1966 Indianapolis 500 was... it was Lloyd Ruby. So there were three people controlling the 1966 Indianapolis 500 during the race, and that was Lloyd Ruby, Jim Clark, and Jackie Stewart. Lloyd Ruby led a significant portion of the race before he ran into issues and had to retire from the race. Jim Clark somehow stalled his car and wasn't able to finish the race, and then Graham Hill managed to get past Jim Clark. So if you combine what happened to those three and obviously the start line crash, he basically did what we call in Australia a Stephen Bradbury. So through a set of strange circumstances, Graham Hill won the 1966 Indianapolis 500, and that would be his best ever result at the race.
Yeah, it certainly was, like I said, you could maybe argue it was a little bit of a fluke considering it was his best ever result, but you have to have an element of luck, I think, to win the Indy 500, because so many things can go wrong, especially with the grid and especially, you know, with the cars back then. That's for sure. But he has to be in that position to take advantage of those little bit of fortune that fell his way. And, you know, it was... I don't think anyone goes, Graham Hill shouldn't have won the Indy 500. The guy was a top driver of the time, so he certainly was worthy of winning that, you know, achievement in 1966. And it would then kind of lead on. He would return to where his Formula One career started, back with Lotus in 1967, because the BRM result, I think, in the previous season, did they finish 5th? I think they did.
Yeah, it was 5th for BRM in 1966. So it looked like things were going a little bit downhill, and Lotus was a team on the up. I'm pretty sure Jim Clark would have been racing for Lotus at that time, so Hill must have seen potential in the team, especially with what he was doing over there. And it would prove to be a team on the up, especially considering what happened in 1968.
Yeah, it definitely did. And Jim Clark definitely was racing for Lotus, and he became teammates with, you know, the late great Jim Clark as well. So I think that probably was a little bit of an appeal as well, because back then there wasn't too much of the F1 politics that you have today. I don't think you didn't really today. Obviously, Vettel's out of a seat, so it would be incredibly bizarre if Mercedes decided to put Lewis Hamilton and Sebastian Vettel in the same team with each other. But back in the 60s and the 50s, you know, you'd quite often have lineups with the top drivers together. You know, I can think of, you know, just some off the top of my head. Obviously, Graham Hill and Jim Clark together in the Lotus, Fangio and Moss together in the Mercedes when that was still going. Peter Collins.
Oh, that would have been during the 50s, so this is 60s now. That was, yeah.
Yeah, sorry, 50s from there. But yeah, from there, and the 58 of Peter Collins and Hawthorne together at Ferrari as well. Yeah, I think that whole Ferrari team was a level of top drivers. So basically the point saying, during this period over these couple of decades, teams certainly weren't afraid of putting the top drivers together. And like you said, when talking about the Triple Crown, if it was a racing car and had wheels on it, and in kind of Surtees's case, it didn't matter whether that was 4 or 2 wheels, you know, they were going to race it. And it was certainly amazing to kind of see those pairings together, certainly. But yeah, Lotus were a team on the up, and it would accumulate in obviously 1968, where, you know, sadly Jim Clark and Mike Spence lost their lives that year. He would go on and win the World Championship with Lotus.
Well, I mean, obviously, talking about the whole contract thing, this was also an era that some teams decided their lineup with just handshake agreements. So that's definitely different to how it would be today. But, well, yeah, Hill was driving the Lotus 49, which is probably one of the most memorable cars. Obviously, a certain part of the season, that was also with the Gold Leaf Lotus, which is an absolutely iconic livery. And obviously, well, it looks like they had the package. But I actually did retire quite a few times throughout that season, because the Lotus Formula One cars, while they were fast, the acronym is for Lotus obviously is lots of trouble, usually serious. And the cars were very fast, but they were often very fragile. So you had to, from what I've heard about what Jim Clark was doing, you had to nurse them to a certain extent. And if you could do that, you would get the most out of these cars. And it looks like, you know, Hill was probably able to do that as well and won the World Championship in 1968.
Yeah, it certainly was a massive... Well, I think this also is the period around where the aerodynamics of the cars were starting to develop. Teams were starting to get an understanding of the aero packages. I think they'd played around with some front wings, some rear wings before that, but I'm pretty sure it's 1968 where they started piecing it all together in a car, and that's also why they were so fragile at the time. I think, you know, it led to a lot of drivers having crashes because they were finding, well, yeah, it was like a new toy, aerodynamics at the time, and a new phenomenon that they were looking to take advantage of and find the pace. But obviously with anything new, there's going to be teething problems with it, and unfortunately for racing car drivers of the time, a lot of the time those teething problems were crashes. And I think Graham Hill, we talked about his character a little bit. One of his funny lines was after crashing at the US Grand Prix in 1969. He was asked if a message was wanted to be passed on to his wife, and he just said, just tell her that I won't be dancing for 2 weeks. I mean,
yeah, it was a different time, and the personalities were larger than life back then.
They certainly were, and I think people were renowned as characters, but in particular Graham Hill. I think he was someone that endeared himself off track as well, and he just had a charisma and aura about him as a personality that, you know, outside of the racetrack during the 70s, he would, I think, become a bit of a TV personality and, you know, be welcomed on to shows before, obviously, his sad passing during the 70s. So, yeah, he certainly combined the life. It was certainly still that era of kind of gentleman racers where they weren't the professional full models. He was probably getting that era, like Sir Stirling Moss, of becoming the first celebrities of motorsport, and he certainly was those characters because he could translate, and people really liked watching him on TV.
Yeah, I also should mention, you talked a little bit about aerodynamics before. The Lotus 49B, which Graham did drive during '68, it actually was one of the first Lotus Formula One cars to actually have aero on it. That was, of course, the upgraded version of the Lotus 49B, which is being used for the first couple of races of the season. But after '68. Well, moving on to '69, he did win the Monaco Grand Prix, and I believe this was the last time he won the Monaco Grand Prix. And that was the shining star in what was otherwise a very lackluster season, with a 7th place in the championship. And then in terms of his Formula One career, that was kind of it. It just kind of dropped off after that.
Yeah, it really did. And, you know, he would stay with Lotus, but then he would move to Brabham in 1971, and that didn't really work out. I'm just looking at his career finishes after that. So he had that 7th in 1969 with Lotus, 13th in 1970 with Lotus, 21st in the 1971 season with Brabham, and 15th in the 1972 season. And then he would have, well, he didn't compete in 1973. It wasn't classified, and 18th in 1974. So, yeah, the 60s was really the peak of Graham Hill in Formula One, but the 70s still saw him pull out a fantastic achievement. And I think you mentioned the first time Randy did this, it was his 16th attempt that in 1972, his 10th attempt that in 1972 he won the Le Mans race, which completed the Triple Crown and, you know, won him prestige from his peers, I'm sure.
Yeah, so as we said, the 1972 24 Hours of Le Mans was Graham Hill's 10th attempt. Up to this point, he had DNF'd quite a lot, which is understandable because Le Mans is a race of quite a high attrition rate. His best result was, up to this point, was a 2nd overall with the Maranello concessionaries. It was in a Ferrari 330p. Then he followed it up with a 2nd in class in 1965. After 1966, he sort of left it for a few years and then came back in 1972 with the Equipe Matra Simca Shell team. And this was the car he was driving was this, it was just a V12 prototype, and he was driving alongside Henry Pescalo, and well, he won. He won overall, and that's an impressive achievement for anyone, really.
Yeah, there isn't really any too many other words you can say than it's an incredible achievement to win Le Mans, and I certainly still think winning Le Mans in that period, it still has prestige today. If you win Le Mans, it's still something that people go, wow. But back then, I would say that was the elite race in motorsport. That was still the one at the very pinnacle at the top, that if you won that, it was almost worldwide fame. And obviously manufacturers were starting to kind of come out of it a little bit, because Ford, who had dominated the late 60s, weren't really seeing the advantage in car sales that they were hoping to see from it. But it was still a massive achievement, and especially considering the safety at the time and the amount of risk that they had to do driving, obviously 24 hours, well, obviously not the whole 24 hours themselves, combined with a teammate. But yeah, it's just an incredible achievement for anyone to win that race, especially at that time in motor racing.
Yeah, and I'm pretty sure after Graham Hill won the race, it was just kind of Porsche, 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 Porsche. After that, like that was basically just it. But yeah, Le Mans, incredible achievement. I mean, I'm not entirely sure what else to say about it. I mean, if you can win Le Mans overall, Le Mans relies on the drivers staying mentally and physically sharp throughout the entire race. It relies on the car being both reliable and fast for the entire race and not running into any issues. And basically, if any of those elements do not click, it's very unlikely you're going to win. And for anyone who wins this race, it's pretty much that's the case. I mean, pretty much I know there are obviously a few examples where the top teams can run into technical issues and still win. I cite 2017 and Porsche, but that was just the way of Le Mans, and it always has been that everything just has to click for 24 hours and you might win. And a big emphasis on might, because you never know what that's not even considering how well your competition is going to do.
Yeah, absolutely. That is, there's so many factors that have to go right that, yeah, to win it and to have it against your name, it's why it was, such a difficult and such a prestigious race to win. And that was the last high point of his motor racing career on track for Graham, which is not a bad high point to go out on, to be fair. And it seemed quite nice that the hardest one for the Triple Crown, I would say at the time, you could argue maybe Indy 500 in there as well. They're all very prestigious and very difficult races to win, but I just think Le Mans was that little step above, and to do that last and to kind of do it must have felt like a huge relief to gain this, although you don't get an official trophy or anything for it. To win this unofficial title was pretty special. Yeah,
it was. And I think maybe we should talk about the Triple Crown as a whole as well, because there are a lot of other people that there are obviously a lot of personalities that came close or are coming close that are worth talking about. And I've written a little bit of a list here. So I think there are some other key personalities when talking about the Triple Crown that you need to talk about, and those are Jim Clark, Bruce McLaren, and Jochen Rindt. The reason I say Jim Clark is he actually only achieved one leg of the Triple Crown, which was the 1965 Indianapolis 500 with Lotus in that beautiful number 82 car. His best result at Le Mans was third with an Aston Martin alongside Roy Salvadori, and his best finish at Monaco was fourth. Now, I know he only achieved one leg of the Triple Crown, But the reason I put him in there is because Jim Clark was amazing, and I think that had he survived, he would have won the other legs at some point, and he probably would have been either the second or third person to ever achieve it. Probably the person I think would have been second to achieve the Triple Crown was Bruce Mclaren. Now, Bruce Mclaren, he won the Monaco Grand Prix in 1962 with the Cooper Car Company, and he won the 1966 24 Hours of Le Mans alongside Chris Amon with Shelby American in the Ford GT. Damn, I think that would make a good movie. But and then he never actually raced at the Indianapolis 500, but McLaren throughout the 60s and 70s, they did have a piece of the pie at Indy. They did actually race cars at Indy. So I think it would have been relatively easy for Bruce to get a drive at Indy at some point and go on to win. And I think if Graham Hill was the first and only to achieve the Triple Crown, Bruce McLaren, had he survived, would have been the second. Now, the final person that I'm going to mention who came close who isn't coming close but came close is Jochen Rindt. He won the Monaco Grand Prix in 1970. He won the 24 Hours of Le Mans in 1965, and there's actually a fascinating story behind the 65 race. And he was driving alongside Maston Gregory in the North American racing team Ferrari 250. Now, the story behind this race is really quite fascinating, and there is actually a YouTube video about this. I don't know what channel it was from. I could probably send Mike a link afterwards, and hopefully he can maybe put it in the description. But what happened at the 1965 race was that this was the beginning of this was when the Ford versus Ferrari rivalry first got really into full swing. And Ferrari and Ford, they both brought a multitude of cars to the race. They brought GT cars, and they obviously brought prototypes. And one of the cars that came to this race was the North American racing team Ferrari 250. All the Ferrari prototypes, they all broke down. And I'm pretty sure all the Ford GT prototypes, they also broke down. And so those are... At Le Mans, you usually expect that a prototype is going to win. So that was an interesting prospect for perhaps a GT car to take the overall win, and that's a very rare occasion in sports car racing. It has happened a few times throughout sports car racing, but this was one of those very rare occasions. Interestingly, all the Fords, the tyre guy who was in charge of it, he discovered whilst the race was going on that they had brought the wrong tyres and they were degrading very, very fast, and he was scared he was going to lose his job. But I think one of the Ford mechanics told him that none of the Fords were actually going to finish because they were all going to break down, and sure enough, they did. So that's where we were with the potential prospect of a GT car winning. There were two Ferrari 250s that were in the running for the win. One of those cars was an Italian Ferrari, and the other car was the North American Ferrari, which Ferrari wouldn't... And the North American Ferrari was also on North American tyres. So, obviously, Ferrari don't want to be beaten by the Americans. That's just not what they want. They want the Italian car to win, and they want the North American car to finish second. However, much to Ferrari's dismay, the Nart car won the race with Jochen Rindt and Maston Gregory, and it was the North American car, obviously, which is not the result that Ferrari would have wanted, and to this day, it remains the last time that Ferrari have won overall at Le Mans.
Which is an incredible story.
It is an incredible story.
And certainly, if you send the link to that kind of video, I definitely will kind of put it in the description down below. But I think, yeah, it's a to all three and also to Graham Hill to say one of the biggest credits to Graham Hill is he survived this era of motor racing. I think he had 176 races to present. 176 race starts in his career, which for the time is incredible. The amount of races that he did, and kind of got through it unscathed as well. And you know, it was a time that obviously Jim Clark, a well-renowned, amazing talent. Bruce Mclaren was a top talent as well. Obviously, sadly, it's 50 years, I think, just recently, the passing of his death. And also Jochen Rindt, the only posthumously awarded Formula One world champion in 1970, where he sadly lost his life as well. And you know, it's sad that we lost all three of those top talents, but also the fact that, you know, it's an incredible achievement that Graham Hill actually managed to survive this period of motor racing as well as being successful in it.
Yeah, and I should also mention that Jochen Rindt, his best finish at Indianapolis was 24th, but something tells me that he wouldn't have been satisfied with that, and had he survived, he probably would have gone back to Indy to try and actually win, and maybe he would have won it. Although, I think we should also talk... I think there are two key personalities now that are involved with the Triple Crown, and oh yeah, do you want to talk about something else first, or
shall we just round off with Graham Hill, and then we'll go full in on the Triple Crown to round off this podcast. So obviously Graham Hill, we spoke about surviving this era of motor racing and was going into management of a team. And actually, on the way back from testing with his team at Paul Ricard, Graham Hill and 5 other members of his crew, I think, sadly crashed in a plane crash and lost their lives. And it was sad because, you know, he survived all that racing, survived all the danger and perils of it, and then it was afterwards a plane crash that would do it. And unfortunately, he was the guy who was piloting it, and if you look into it, the plane wasn't really insured, and all his qualifications were out of date, and it was very dangerous conditions. But I imagine there were probably quite a fair few of those incidents, and it was just probably unlucky on the day. And sadly, we lost a personality that I feel Graham Hill would have been around the F1 paddock for a long time, and sad that, you know, we never got to see his son Damon become a world champion in Formula One himself.
Yeah, although I saw recently that Damon Hill said that had his father survived, he thinks that he never would have become a racing driver. I'm not entirely sure why he said that, but I'm sure I'll probably look into it at some point. But I think that's an interesting thing. But yeah, as you said, you know, he survived all that racing only to die in a plane crash. And I sort of compare that to Michael Schumacher, because, you know, he went through Formula One in the 90s, which was still a very dangerous period. Like, and people say, oh, you know, the 60s and 70s were, you know, the most dangerous period in Formula One. So many people died during this era. Well, yes, but even still during the 80s and 90s, a lot of people suffered life-changing injuries. Like, if you look at Martin Brundle and a few other guys, you know, they have all this damage to their feet because of what happened. But that's besides the point. Michael, you know, he went on to win world championship, like 7 world championships, most successful statistically Formula One driver ever. But and then, you know, what happened to him was that skiing accident. Obviously, he's still alive, but, you know, it's I'm not entirely sure what kind of life he's living now. And it's just, I don't want to say ironic, but it's just strange that these guys who are seemingly larger than life become the best in their field. Something like this happens to them. Something completely unrelated to motorsport happens to them. And it's especially strange with Graham Hill, because he was driving in one of the most dangerous periods in Formula One, and then he got through all of that only to die in a plane crash, which is a crying shame, and it's very tragic.
Well, yeah, any loss of life too soon is incredibly tragic. But yeah, certainly in the circumstances with Graham Hill, and after all he'd gone through, yeah, it was incredibly sad to lose him. But you know, his legacy in Formula One is, well, he's a 2-time Formula One world champion, the only man to ever have the Triple Crown unofficial title next to his name to date. Obviously, we'll go on and talk about a couple of candidates who are in the running to still achieve that award, who are still racing. But yeah, it was an incredible career. The prime of it in Formula One was during the 1960s, but you know, winning the Indy 500 and obviously Le Mans in 1972, it was a long-spanning career, an incredible just level of consistent high performance for a guy at the time, I would say.
Yeah, absolutely. And he'll always be remembered in motorsport as one of, if not the greatest racing driver of all time. And that's special. To be a candidate for the GOAT is very, very special. But obviously, as we mentioned, there are two people that you do need to talk about when talking about the Triple Crown nowadays, and the first of those two people is Fernando Alonso.
Yeah, I mean, Fernando is the only one mainly actively pursuing it, I would say. Well, I know actually the other name, which is Juan Pablo Montoya, who's still there with new regulations coming in to the WEC. Certainly you'll go on and explain that in a bit further detail, that there is a possibility that he could be coming into play on that one. But Fernando Alonso is very openly, obviously during his time with McLaren in 2017, tried to win the Indy 500, which is the last bit of the crown, well, the last leg of the crown that he needs to complete, and was leading the race actually. Was it for 21, 28 laps? Something around there. He was in the 20s.
So in 2017, when Fernando Alonso first went over, so obviously at this point he'd won the Monaco Grand Prix in 2006 and 2007 with Renault and McLaren respectively, and then when he went over to Indy, obviously, you know, McLaren weren't doing well with Honda and stuff, and he sort of Indy this year is very, very ironic. Now, McLaren that year were in a partnership with Andretti Autosport, who run Honda engines, and normally Andretti Autosport are one of the best teams on the grid, and the Honda engine usually works fine, and they win races all the time, so it made sense for McLaren to partner with such a successful team. However, in perhaps one of the most ironic motorsport things, Fernando Alonso skipped the Monaco Grand Prix because he wasn't happy with Honda and Formula One. Then he went over to the US to drive another Honda, and strangely enough, most of the Andretti Autosport cars, they all blow up. Basically, it is incredibly ironic what happened to him, and sure enough, Fernando Alonso's engine went kaboom after having led a significant portion of the race, although strangely enough, another Andretti Autosport car went on to win the race in 2017, and that was Takuma Sato. And then, well, between then and the next time that Fernando Alonso would go to Indy, he would obviously leave McLaren, and he would join Toyota Gazoo Racing for the 2018-19 2018-19. I think that, or oh my god, was it 27? I can't remember what season it was, but regardless, he went into the World Endurance Championship and raced at Le Mans in 2018 alongside Sebastian Buemi and Kazuki Nakajima, and yes, it was 2018-19. Oh, no, it wasn't. Yes, it was 2018-19. Sorry, I was forgetting what year the coronavirus happened, and which is, of course, this year. But for 2018-19, entered World Endurance Championship with Toyota alongside Sebastian Buemi and Kazuki Nakajima, which was the super season, and this was the first time the WEC had run Le Mans twice in a season, and Toyota were just dominant that season because, well, arguably that's because Porsche pulled out and they were competing against privateer cars that didn't have a hybrid system and were hastily built, but whatever the case, it was still an achievement, and they won Le Mans this lineup won Le Mans both times in that season. Now, in 2019, Fernando Alonso would go back to Indianapolis. Now, obviously, he had fallen out with Honda at this time, and Andretti Autosport was still firmly a Honda team. So that would mean that Fernando Alonso would have to drive for a Chevy team. And because of Zach Brown's involvement with Carlin, I believe he's involved with Carlin. Alonso, well, I'm sure. I think one of the key stakeholders of McLaren, they are part of Carlin in some way. But because of that connection to McLaren and Carlin, the logical step at the time was to race with Carlin. Now, Carlin was a very new team to IndyCar, and they weren't the most experienced. And 2019. Their effort at Indy was just a disaster, really. So, during testing, the Carlin cars, they had electrical issues. During practice, Alonso wrecked the car, and for some reason, in repairing the car, they focused more on the paint job than they actually did setting up the car. And come bump qualifying, it was one of the biggest upsets in probably recent motorsport history. Fernando Alonso and McLaren Carlin, as well as most of the other Carlin cars, bar one, were bumped out by Kyle Kaiser, who was driving for Juncos, which is one of the most underfunded teams in IndyCar. So 2019 was an embarrassment, but of course he is going back this year, and it should be a little bit better.
Yeah, McLaren are now linked with Arrows, aren't they?
Schmidt-Peterson Motorsport, yeah.
Schmidt-Peterson Motorsport from there. They call them McLaren Arrows team now. Arrows is definitely in there.
It's Arrows, McLaren, Schmidt-Peterson. I'm pretty sure that's the official name for the team.
There we go, in full detail. But yes, obviously I think that wasn't Alonso's first choice. It was to go back with Andretti, but that connection with Honda seems to have vetoed the decision as well. But we'll see whether it will be successful.
In fact, I don't even think it was his third. It wasn't even his second choice either.
Probably not.
I think he was linked with Ed Carpenter Racing, and I think the McLaren said they were partnering with Schmidt-Peterson Motorsport, which was probably a better option because Schmidt-Peterson, they are at least consistently a midfield team, and that can occasionally find themselves onto the podium and race victories. And with that that funding injection coming from McLaren, they should be doing a lot better. But then Alonso left McLaren as an ambassador, and we thought that was the end of the partnership, and there was no way he was getting a drive for this year. But then I'm assuming he went back to Zach Brown with puppy eyes and asked for his old job back, and they gave him the third seat for the Indianapolis 500 with Schmidt-Peterson Motorsport. So it might go better this year.
It might do indeed, and he's obviously, like we said, probably been the most public pursuer of the Triple Crown. But there's also another guy who hasn't quite been as public with it, but it certainly would be an interesting one, and that is Juan Pablo Montoya. So do you want to kind of expand a little bit on how Juan Pablo Montoya actually might beat Alonso to the crown if Alonso doesn't win Indy this year?
So Juan Pablo Montoya, he won the Indianapolis 500 in 2000 and 2015 with Chip Ganassi Racing and Penske, respectively. He, of course, won the Monaco Grand Prix in 2003 with Williams. And his best Le Mans finish in 2018, I believe, which was with United Autosport with Hugo de Sadalier and Will Owen. That was in P2. However, sports car racing is experiencing a massive shift at the moment, and LMP1 in the WEC and DPI in IMSA are both being scrapped in favor of Hypercar and LMDH, respectively. Now, LMDH and Hypercar, they are being combined into one class, meaning that they're two different types of cars that will be able to compete for the overall win in both the WEC and IMSA. Now, Juan Pablo Montoya is part of Team Penske, who run the Acura DPI, and it's expected that, obviously, the Acura and Team Penske will eventually develop an LMDH car and go race. And that means that they will be eligible to race at Le Mans. Now, if I'm not sure how the BOP is going to work. I mean, usually the ACO kind of screws over American cars, but if all goes well, I mean, this is a massively outside chance, but if all goes well, Team Penske and Acura could win the 24 Hours of Le Mans with Juan Pablo Montoya, which would give him the Triple Crown. Now, say Fernando Alonso doesn't do well at Indy, he could and depending on what happens with LMDH, and the new regulations coming in, whether they get pushed back, Juan Pablo Montoya could actually beat Fernando Alonso to it. Now, this is a massively outside chance, but if Penske and Acura can make a good LMDH car that doesn't get screwed over by the balance of performance, then he could actually win it and beat Fernando Alonso to it. Or if not that, if all goes well, he could be the third ever man to achieve it right after Alonso.
Yeah, it's still incredible that you have two racing drivers today who could achieve it, and it's almost been a bit of a rejuvenation in the Triple Crown. It's come more back into people's minds. So obviously, it's been an opening. I remember in the first time round we did this, the 60s was kind of the prime. Obviously, we were talking about that earlier, that racing car drivers were racing car drivers. Any series, whatever, if there was a seat available, they would do it. It's not to that same extent today, but there is becoming a lot more fluidity to seats, especially, say, if an F1 driver competed like Fernando for a long time within the sport, they can then go on to other series and compete in them as well as guest appearances in races such as the Indy 500, become more and more popular from that. I wouldn't be surprised if we saw someone like a Lando Norris as well in the future have a show off to there, because I know Zach Brown has spoken about his willingness to let his drivers compete in other series. So that would certainly be an interesting one on that front.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, as we said before, so back in the 60s, I'll use Ferrari as an example. Ferrari was just Ferrari. The drivers from the Grand Prix team would then also go and race prototypes at Le Mans. This has brought so much more. What Fernando Alonso is doing has brought so much more attention back to the Triple Crown, and I wouldn't be surprised that in the next few years we see more drivers go and do other series. Lando Norris has expressed interest in doing the Triple Crown, but he said later in his career, because obviously the Indianapolis 500 is on the same day as the Monaco Grand Prix, so that wouldn't quite work for him at this stage. But I could definitely see him maybe. This is probably like 10 years down the track, but I could probably see Lando Norris racing at Indy, which would be cool. And I'm sure other racing drivers will go and do this as well. And I think other series like the WEC and IndyCar, the careers obviously last longer in those series than they do in Formula One. But some drivers who do Formula One, they go over and do these other series after the end of their racing career. Excuse me. And we saw this with Felipe Massa doing Formula E. Rubens Barrichello went over and did IndyCar for a short time. Takuma Sato is still in IndyCar and still doing very well. And obviously other drivers, Formula One doesn't work out for everybody. And even if you are Formula One material, doesn't necessarily mean that you'll make it in Formula One. So obviously Sebastian Buemi, he's doing Formula E and he's also doing the WEC. Bruno Senna, he didn't quite make it in Formula One, but then he does quite well in sports car racing. Brendan Hartley, he was actually a sports car driver to begin with, did Formula One, that didn't really work out for him, but, he sort of landed on his feet. So I think it's nice seeing other drivers race in other series, no matter what the circumstance, because it boosts publicity for that series. I'll use Kimi Räikkönen in the truck series, in the NASCAR truck series, and the nationwide series, I believe it was back then. That boosted popularity for those series to, they were a much higher. The viewing for that, qualifying for those races was much higher. Same kind of went for IndyCar when Fernando Alonso was doing it in 2017. and it just boosts the popularity of other series, and it boosts the that particular driver's popularity in other areas. And I think it's good to see that era finally come back.
Yeah, I'd agree with that, and I'd say motorsport as a whole, if it's stronger, so with these drivers going to other series and competing, it kind of maintains the safety of all aspects of motorsport, because you've got loads of talented drivers. A lot of people's association with motorsport is the drivers. They get attached to drivers and they love seeing their favourite drivers compete. So like you said, if Kimi Raikkonen's competing in NASCAR trucks, if Fernando Alonso's in Indy 500, I'll throw a name out there in terms of who might be interested in pursuing the Triple Crown. Might be Daniel Ricciardo. Obviously he already has the Monaco link, and with now moving to McLaren for the 2021 season, it could be something that is a future partnership that he looks to go into at the tail end of his career, if the shot for winning a Formula 1 World Championship is past him. But yeah, it's fantastic, I think, as a whole for motorsport to boost, and the Triple Crown certainly can be something that unites these series and builds just the general profile of motorsport as a whole, not just what F1 does, which is the pinnacle of motorsport and just drives that one series up forwards. The spread of other series being highlighted, because there's lots of brilliant series out there, is certainly fantastic, I think, for motorsport as a whole.
Yeah, exactly. And you mentioned Daniel Ricciardo there, potentially doing the Triple Crown. There's also talk of them maybe in the future doing the Bathurst 1000, which would be really special if that were able to materialize in some respect, although that again is sort of inconvenient whilst he's racing in Formula 1 because it clashes with the Japanese Grand Prix. But maybe if they change that, Zach Brown, I think, mentioned that if maybe sometime in the future we could see Daniel Ricciardo and Lando Norris on a Walkinshaw Andretti United lineup at Bathurst, which again would boost the popularity of supercars. And I think supercars would probably need that sort of popularity, especially at the moment, considering what's going on with Holden and stuff. But again, that probably won't happen for a while. But, one can dream, I suppose. But maybe we don't have to dream, because we're seeing a return of the era when racing drivers go off and do lots of different series. And if you think about Jim Clark wasn't just a Formula 1 driver. He was doing everything. He was doing touring cars, he was doing Formula 2, and Bruce McLaren, he was doing Formula 1, he was doing Can-Am, and it just boosts the popularity of all these different series, and it keeps racing drivers busy. And I think it's just great for all parties involved.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think that's probably a very good place to round off, unless you have any final thoughts on the podcast that we've had today, Jack.
Not particularly. I'm looking forward to seeing what the future of motorsport as a whole, that obviously includes the series that are involved with the Triple Crown and of course other different series. I'm very interested to see how that sort of thing plays out over the next couple of years, and maybe if Fernando Alonso can take the W at Indy this year. But you never know, it might not happen, and maybe when Pablo Montoya might get his overall Le Mans win that he needs. I'm excited to see what the next few years of motorsport holds, and as soon as we get out of this COVID-19 crisis, we can finally get on with it, which I'm very much looking forward to. But again, thank you so much for having me on, and thanks for having me on again. I know I made a bit of a mistake and deleted some important things the first time we did it, but I'm glad that we could still do this.
No problem at all, Jack. It's been absolutely brilliant having you on, and having a second time chat. I think we've even discussed a few different things this time around, because that's quite nice having this kind of second chat, because I think actually it happened recently with an F1 Worldwide with Cranky Yankee, and again, even though you have that kind of second chat round, it still kind of feels fresh, and especially having like a week between recordings as well. It's been quite nice. But thank you so much for coming on. It's been brilliant to kind of get you on. And guys, if you haven't found Jack's channel, which is Triple Crown Racing, I highly recommend it. It doesn't only cover some stuff within F1, it just covers motorsport in general. That is Jack's niche in this F1 community. He gives you fantastic knowledge of motorsport as a whole, and I cannot recommend his videos enough. So Jack, thank you for coming on.
Thank you very much, and make sure before you go and check out my channel, give a sub to F1 Fanatics as well. But yeah, thank you. I've thoroughly enjoyed myself.
Thank you very much, Jack. And guys, if you've enjoyed this podcast, like Jack said, you can subscribe to the channel and click that bell notification to keep up to date with all our latest content. And there's only a couple more of F1 Worldwides to come before we return to action, fingers crossed, hopefully, in Austria at the start of July. But also get involved in the comments down below. Me and Jack would both love to hear what your kind of thoughts are on Graham Hill, what your thoughts are on the Triple Crown, your thoughts are on, obviously, the active guys in Fernando Alonso and Juan Pablo Montoya doing it, but also the prospect of racing drivers in general competing in more series rather than just the series that they're attached to for the majority of their careers. It certainly would be an interesting one on that front. But that's it from us today, guys. So for now, you F1 fans, keep racing!